Yes, we are live. I'm back with my friend Brandon. How you doing? Can you hear me?
Doing okay. I'm doing okay.
What's new since we last spoke? It's been a couple of weeks.
Well, I went out. It's been a good day. It's been a good day. Well, yeah. I'll see where the conversation leads, right?
Yeah, well, what were you thinking? What were you thinking about discussing today? Were there some topics? Did you have anything that's
Well,
on your mind?
sure. I mean, I had some questions. I had some questions
Yeah.
because I'm genuinely curious. Okay, so I have a question for you. All right.
Okay. Okay.
What is your opinion on evolution?
It's BS.
Okay. So I'm kind of at a point where I'm agnostic about evolution. So I want to get your take on why is evolution false?
Because of the principle of proportionate causality, you cannot give what you do not have. Period.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's yeah, I mean I'm at a point I'm probably leaning towards sort of like the other end, but I'm at a point where I'm sort of I suppose agnostic. I mean, I suppose I have felt that there's an issue. What his name? If I'm gonna say it correctly, Rene Descartes or Descartes, or however you.
Descartes. Day like the day and night. Day
Yeah,
cart like a horse cart.
yeah.
Descartes. Instead of a night trolley,
Okay,
it's a day cart.
the Rene Descartes. He started his entire philosophy, as far as I'm aware, on skepticism,
Yep.
and I'm kind of
Radical
going to
doubt.
take this,
Radical doubt.
and I'm going to kind of steal a take from Father Ripperger, but he basically said, like, do I have an example here? Okay. I have to have an example here. Hang on.
Watch out for the
Right. So, like,
lizards.
if you, for instance, okay, so Rene Descartes, right? Descartes, he basically summed his entire philosophy on skepticism.
Yep.
And one thing he's basically put out is that if you take like a stick, right, and if you like stick it in a cup of water and place it in a cup of water, the stick will appear bent. But I know intellectually that it doesn't bend, so I can't trust my senses to tell me the truth. And yet that is sort of the problem with depending on merely observable evidence. So, which to me seems to be what the theory of evolution precisely is. And with science, you have to stick with like the first principles. I would admit that evolution is absolutely true if depending on merely natural capacity, yet science is sort of made up of philosophy, metaphysics, and naturalism. And the theory of evolution is a conclusion drawn by science if only depending on naturalism. So, you kind of need to depend on the full picture of it. But the angle that evolution takes, it's sort of like a butchering of science where you take it on the naturalist end. And I think what you brought up is that there's some philosophical and metaphysical issues with it. But that's just sort of where I'm at right now, where I suppose I'm a bit more agnostic with it, right?
Yeah. Just let me give you a thought experiment, okay? I do this with all my guests who believe in evolution. So I'm going to pretend that you believe in evolution because you're on the fence. So if you believe in, let's just say that you believe in evolution. So we can go back millions of years, billions of years, and we can look at the quote unquote beginning of the universe after the Big Bang, whatever. And we can take a snapshot of that universe in its very early stages using our mind's eye as a thought experiment, okay? So if we take a snapshot and we take stock of what's in that universe, its fundamental elementary particles, there are no cells, there are no life forms, there is no life according to the atheistic evolutionary worldview, okay? Now, from my perspective, there's always life in the universe because there are always angels and there's God and everything else, okay? But from the atheistic evolution point of view, if we go back and we look at the early universe and we take a snapshot, we take stock of what's in it, it's not very interesting. But what they have to admit that they are proposing with their worldview is that that clump of molecules and elementary particles has the potential to change, aka to evolve into you and me and all the rest of us and all the wonderful flora and the fauna and everything that we have. So what does that mean? If we admit that, if we're willing to admit that, what does it mean? With or without, God's help, what does it mean? It means that that potential was there, and that rocks have the potential to become human, because we are already accepting that as axiomatic. Like that's that's a given for the evolutionist, that rocks have the potential to become human. There is no escape from that. So I reject evolution out of hand because of that, because it's absolutely absurd. It's absolutely absurd to say that rocks have the potential to become human.
Man, that's so bizarre, though. I mean, that is true. Like, if you profess the theory of evolution, like, I mean, you are seeing how everything kind of came from a rock, right? I mean, I know people kind of say that to slander evolution, but it is true, right? Or like some sort of gases or whatever it was.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're saying that, like, it's just such a strange way to put it. But yeah, you believe that a rock can become a human, and that is kind of what you believe on a long scale, right? But that's quite bizarre, I suppose.
So as a human, we can go to the beach, pick up a rock or a stone or some slime out of the ocean, and we can look at it and say, "Hey, cousin, like, we're related. We're related. I'm in you, you're in me," and all that sort of thing, because we have minerals in us, and the minerals have us in them potentially. So it's just like, this is a total pantheistic New Age. It's a religion. It is a religion. Yeah. Okay, it's called Gnosticism. It's the New Age religion. And it's just, it's a bunch of hogwash. It's a joke.
Yeah,
it's a sad joke.
Like I mentioned, like, evolution seems to be a betrayal of metaphysics, and is this proselytization of science, where it sort of proselytizes science, where, it strips away sort of the philosophical and metaphysical conflicts. They sort of just depend merely on naturalism. And, if you depend merely on naturalism, like observable evidence, right, you'll find things that appear ancient. And I'm admitting all, if one wants to argue for evolution and presents me the evidence, I mean, the evidence is valid if you're depending on that method, right, of naturalism. You find these rocks or whatever, and they appear old, and you date them to however old they were, right? And you sort of get that pattern. But again, if you look at a full scale of philosophy, metaphysics, and then naturalism, there are conflicts. And it just seems to me that, like, it's sort of this proselytization of science, where it's really just depending only on naturalism, on the naturalist method, if you could call it that. And if depending only on naturalism, like, if you will have you will have a theory of evolution if you depend only on naturalism. And it is sort of this butchering of science, as I said. And it's quite interesting. But, like, you're bringing up, I suppose, maybe a philosophical conflict. I'm not really sure if it was philosophical, but you brought up something, right? But something too, right? I have a note here I wrote about it just because I was thinking about it, right? But, like, with the biblical view, man was perfect in the Garden of Eden, right? Yep. He had no need for evolution. He was perfect and was at full capacity in his senses. Yep. So lacking nothing in his humanity and not needing evolution.
Absolutely.
And yet, so what evolution does, it sort of affirms that humanity was lacking, and that that evolution affirms that humanity was lacking in its beginning, and that it's evolving into an absolute, right? Whereas sort of the theological view affirms that it was full and perfect in the beginning, and yet after that there's a descent and the fall of mankind. What I think is interesting is that, the fall of Adam shows a degradation of humanity, and what you'll find, for instance, is that there is, like, a decline in IQ, sort of affirming a fallen state. And there's a lot of little things you can pick at like that, where it seems like we're almost de-evolving, which would sort of affirm that position, that we're a fallen state. Evolution is the precise opposite, right? And it could be sort of this Nietzschean Antichrist phase that we're going through, where it's a literal inversion of Christian morals, but that's a whole other thing. But, like, it is kind of like this conflict, right?
Absolutely. You nailed it. Exactly.
Okay. let me see.
There's one other thing I want to say. I want to throw
Yeah.
out there. Then you can come back at me with whatever you want. The image that comes to mind is a family. There's the mother, the father. They met. They fell in love by God's grace. There was a complementarity. They did a mutual self-giving, a selfless giving of one to the other, and that gave forth a fruit, the children that they have. They love and protect their children. They educate their children about God and love for God and love their neighbor and everything else. It's a beautiful, beautiful image. Okay. Now, contrast that with pornography, hookers, prostitutes, and all that stuff that we're being fed as a substitute, a cheap substitute for the wholesome, loving family. We're being given by Satan pornography, and the word pornography comes from the word whore, prostitute. That's where the word pornography comes from. We're given a cheap substitute by Satan, like, hey, you don't need to commit, you don't need to love, you just need to get your willy wet, and that's it. That's it. Just have physical pleasure, because all you are is an ape. So to me, this is very, 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 very deeply connected to evolution. This idea that, hey, you know what? We don't need to believe in love. All we have are neurons firing. Some are pleasurable, some are not pleasurable. So let's go towards the pleasure and let's avoid the pain. And hey, if life gets too tough, you can sign up for MAID and we'll put you out of your misery.
Mm-hmm.
So it's all connected. It's all connected, I think, to the evolutionary worldview. It's sick. It's satanic.
Yeah, like the thing is, right, I don't know. No, I didn't say this. I was just talking to a friend, right, actually earlier about this. So the Big Bang Theory, for instance, right, to sort of sum it up, not to do any injustice to it at all, but to sort of sum it up, the universe kind of just spits out, right? And so that's why the universe kind of goes in a certain angle because of the way that it went. However, a lot of scientists are discovering, I don't know if there's solar systems, again, I'm not an expert on this, but basically there's things that seem to predate the Big Bang Theory, which is impossible because the Big Bang is the start of everything that is practically. So if you're finding things that conflict, right, like with like a solar system or whatever it is, a galaxy, again, I'm not an expert on this, but whatever, they predate the Big Bang Theory. You're finding conflicts in your theory that kind of just shows that your theory is BS. If there's little contradictions, right? If it's true, everything has to flow with it, right? But there's little things like that. I mean, I guess with like fossils, right? There's that famous fossils that were found where apparently human footprints were seen along with dinosaur footprints, which is rather bizarre, but whatever, the fact that they're both fossilized would show that it was like some sort of mud, right, when the dinosaurs were walking through it. And then somehow it was mud again when humans walk through it. I mean, take the theory of evolution, right? The time that the dinosaurs walked in that mud, and now the time that the humans walked in that mud, those would have been fossilized, right? But they're both fossilized in the same sense, if that makes sense. And there's like this conflict there, and like something with fossils that's rather interesting is it's almost like these mass graves at sometimes. It looks like a giant massacre just suddenly occurred that basically killed everything. And I'm sort of at a point where, regardless of whether it's the creationist view that it just happened or the evolution view that was millions of years, you kind of come to a point where it's kind of just a fact that there was some sort of global flood. Like that's kind of how mountains are kind of formed. I mean, I live in Ontario, and so much of Ontario is historically known for being underwater at points. Like there's a place it's past Toronto. It's called Mount Nemo, and it's rather bizarre going up there. And it was sort of like a revelation to me because you're looking down at the cliff, and you're just looking at sort of the way that the cliff is, and you can tell like it was formed by water. Well, if you were to go back at that time, that water would have been overtowering Toronto and all that stuff. And it's like practically, yeah, I mean, it seems like there was something that happened. I mean, it's rather interesting, but and with scientists, a lot of people will say like, okay, well, why do scientists like, all scientists affirm the theory of evolution and all that stuff. So like, if that's what the science is aiming at, then that's how it is. But the thing is, we only hear from like so many scientists. There's like 80% of scientists we don't even hear from. It's like this small class of elite scientists that give their takes on everything. And that's what we have to affirm as the science. Whilst there's literally 80% or so not taking my word for it, but 80% of like scientists that we just don't hear from. And there are a lot of remarkable scientists who don't necessarily profess the Darwinian theory of evolution, and not because, you know, they're religious fanatics and just believe the Bible, and they're like, well, the Bible says 6 days, so I don't believe in it, right? Like they have a lot of thorough philosophical and metaphysical problems they have with it. You know, and I think, like, obviously, if you're religious, like, a part of me is ashamed, right, that like the Bible isn't enough. Like I read the Bible and it's okay, 6 days, everything was made, and then there's a flood. Like that should be enough for me. But at the same time, I think that there's room where that is left for interpretation, if that makes sense. But at the same time, you do kind of have like a lot of I don't know. I'm agnostic with the problem, right? But I'm probably leaning more towards that evolution is kind of just this, all these conflicts. Anyway, all right. So I have a next question, and I'm not agnostic on this issue. I have a firm position that I'm not on this issue. I don't believe this. All right. But let's say you read the Bible, right? You read the Bible, you have 6 days, and you take that literally or what have you. How far away are you from getting to the position of the Earth being under a firmament?
Firmament, like that
Yeah.
dome.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
It's never really been something I've been tempted to believe at all.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. There's certainly, if you look at like the iconography of Christian art, like for the past 2,000 years, it seems to always depict Earth as a globe, right? But the narrative that people put out is that the Bible says the Earth is flat, and so if you were to take it literally, like the 6 days, that you should take that. But there's instances in the Bible where it appears to kind of explain the Earth as a globe or a sphere, right?
Yeah.
Or oblate, or however we call it today. But yeah, like I think it's Isaiah maybe, where it talks about how the Earth it has no foundation. It's not. It's like basically floating.
Hanging, yeah.
Yeah, and you know, there are passages where there's some odd instances, like, okay, well, the four corners of the Earth. How do you make sense of that? Well, I mean, maybe this isn't the best argument, but like, you know, if it were flat, right, you could take four corners. But technically, you know, if it was a globe, they're not true corners, but you could point at four parts of the globe, if that makes
North,
sense, right?
east, south, and west.
Yeah, like it. They might not be corners literally, but again, I don't even know what the ancient Hebrew actually means by corner, right? It might just mean like a estimation or whatever. I don't know, but the whole flat Earth thing kind of seems odd because it's like it's kind of a new thing that people are making up, because people in ancient time kind of, it seems that the flat Earth is more believed now than it ever was.
Yeah.
Like back in time,
Yeah.
it seems like people, the narrative, the conspiracy is that we're all being deceived with this globe thing right now, where it kind of looks like the opposite. The more ancient you go, it seems that everyone knew that it was round, but that now people are saying it's flat. And in ancient cultures, the only ones who were saying it was flat were like some Buddhists and tribal people, Christians and Greeks, and all those people in sort of the Western society at the time all kind of knew it was round. And you know, people, I hear people conflict and say, well, oh, well, the Greeks were pagan or whatever, so why take their theory? Well, okay, Jesus was in that time. The apostles were. They never conflicted with that Greek idea. They appreciated a lot of Greek philosophy. I mean, St. Paul complimented, I think it was maybe the Greeks or some of the Roman people. He was saying, like, look, you're clearly very religious and whatnot, right? But I'm telling you who the God is that you should be aiming at. And so, you know, and of course, St. Paul frequently quotes Greek philosophy, as far as I'm aware. So that's rather interesting. But yeah, I mean, the whole thing about flat Earth is that if you were to go back in time, who is it held by? Some Buddhists, some different neo-pagan, well, I guess true pagan group at that time, tribal people who believed that their island was all the Earth that there was, and that the rest of the ocean around them was sitting on like the back of a whale or a turtle. But other than that, like people who are more colonists, like the Greeks and Romans who spread out everywhere, and then eventually the Christians, they all kind of had an idea of this globe sphere sort of thing. And then that idea, they kind of just had an idea that the Earth was kind of like that, as far as I can see. And this whole thing about flat Earth seems to be more believed now
Yeah,
than
for
ever
sure.
was by any of
For
these
sure.
people. So it's rather interesting. It's sort of similar to, I suppose, the Black Israelites. They'll go and they'll say King James, he was a black man. You know that? I know there's a lot of purities about that, but they'll like point at any white figure in history, just some random European, and they'll say that everyone was black at some point, and that we all people the bad people became white in like the Middle Ages. So like, well, no, I mean, King James was like what the king of what was he the king of? Well, he was
He was the
white,
king.
and
He was the king of black people.
yeah, like it's and even then there was like that movie or whatever Netflix thing about who was it, like some
Littlest Mermaid.
it was Egyptian figure, and there's a lot of controversy about it, but she's depicted as a black woman, and actual Egyptian people are making responses to that because even though it's African, they're not necessarily black in Egypt, right? So it's rather bizarre, but it's like there's stuff like that where it's like, okay, well, okay, and I know Eric Andre did a parody where he was like black Scientologists, and they're totally parodying the Black Hebrew Israelites, but he was basically there with some guys saying that the founder of Scientology, who was some white
L. Ron
author,
Hubbard. Yeah, L. Ron Hubbard.
yeah, he was a black man. And for those unaware, Scientology was founded by a fiction author. He wrote science fiction, and he was just some white guy who, like, if I wrote science fiction novels and decided to create a religion out of that, that's literally Scientology. Like, that's just the history of it. And yeah, he was basically having a depiction on the side of him as a black man, and that's what they do. There's if you see Black Israelites, they'll have depictions like King James as a black man and George Washington, wherever. It's just it's rather bizarre. But I know it's the same thing with the flat Earth theory. Is that like a claim is that like, oh well, everyone, it was what the science showed before science became Masonic or whatever. But if you look, every culture knew it was not flat. No one said that unless if you were like some tribal pagans living on like an island who was literally ignorant of the rest of the world. So, it wasn't your fault that you held that theory. It's just that you didn't know better. But it was rather bizarre. I suppose I mean there's obviously a lot of lies about stuff, so people are kind of just assuming that the narrative is always the opposite of what's mainstream, but I don't know what to hold to that. But yeah, I mean, I suppose that's an interesting position, right? Because evolution has conflicts, but then someone might take like, well, okay, if you read the Bible about the 6 days and how that happens, why not just believe it's flat also? But I don't necessarily see that as an explicit narrative in the Bible.
Not at
And
all. Not at all. And the other thing is, I have good metaphysical reasons to believe in fiat creation, young Earth creation.
mhm.
Um, I I also have good dogmatic reasons to believe in young Earth creationism. Uh, when it comes to flat Earth, I don't have any. There are no implications. The metaphysics, we can debunk it using just natural science, right? So we don't
Mhm.
need. We don't even need to dig into the metaphysics of flat Earth. We can just look at the physics of flat Earth, right, and debunk it.
Yeah.
But more importantly, there's no theological reason for me to get excited about the shape of the Earth. There's
Mhm.
absolutely no theological reason for me to get excited about it. It's irrelevant. It's irrelevant. Okay. But
Mhm.
for you to tell me that Adam and Eve were inferior to me, that's a slap in my face. That's a slap in the face of Jesus Christ. But to say the Earth is a cube or a sphere or a polygon or whatever, that's just, who cares? Literally, who cares? I don't care until you give me a reason. Give me a reason why I should care. I don't care. Now,
So
yeah, go ahead.
the analogy that I've heard for Genesis is that it's like a mountain, and at the top of the mountain is paradise, and you descend to sort of the waters that are of chaos that you sort of find in the earlier stages of Genesis, where it's just chaos and abyss, and you go up this mountain to paradise where man and God meet. And the fall of Adam, the fall of man, is descent from paradise, a descent from mountain into this fallen state. So it's like a literal analogy. And again, what I was explaining, you have lower IQs, you have these declining things. People are becoming dumber. People are becoming more receptive to things that hurt us. Evolution should be strengthening us, building us up to that perfect state. to an absolute form from the fallen state to the paradise, but we're finding a decline. And that just seems to affirm the Christian narrative that this like de-evolution have you rather than this aiming towards an absolute, but this degradation. And I mean, there's a lot of chaos too. And it's like evolution is everything. You have to understand that. It's like not just physical, it's psychological, it's everything. And so like if you have a strong Catholic Christian power, everything works out. And you have to understand evolution is everything. It's not just the moving of one species to another. It's everything. It's a civilization as well. So technically, if you affirm evolution is true, Christianity has a part in that. You kind of have to realize that. And I think this might have been, I could be wrong, don't count me on this, but C.S. Lewis, I think this was his position, is that Christianity is kind of like the final form of evolution, if that makes sense. Like if you believe in evolution, the fact that Christianity takes place in history and evolution is the long-term view of history, this thing that takes place is sort of like the final place where you have theosis, where God and man come together. Well, that's literally what I was explaining. If you were to fit in that narrative, right? But it seems like you would have to kind of aim there. Like, what's the point in evolution? It's aiming towards something, and that seems to be philosophical. That seems to be metaphysical. Maybe even kind of a religious thing, like the fact that it's occurring. And again, I wasn't raised religious, so I was sort of like taught about like evolution and whatnot in my school, right? And the view of evolution that I kind of viewed is like, okay, well, you have these species that are aiming towards something better, right? Like monkey, the ape, to man. Again, I'm not taking my word, I'm not expert, but you have kind of that event. It's like, well, how does nature know? Like, it seems like there's a higher force, consciousness, power, what have you, that's in behind all this. So to me, I wasn't really religious, but for a while I did have a belief in God as a child, even though I was never like told about God. People eventually would mention God and I would be familiar with what they were saying. But I kind of be just based on my understanding of evolution, like this, like why isn't everything evolving into chaos and just random mix of just abyss? But the fact that you have these things that are aiming towards something better for the survival of the fittest, like all these things, seems to be that there's something aiming towards a greater good. And that itself is like a theological, like it seems like evolution is kind of interesting on that angle. But now I'm at a point where it's like, well, I'm just finding conflicts with it. And I suppose I'm agnostic on the theory of evolution.
Yeah, well, I spoke with one famous theistic evolutionist. He's a Protestant guy. He's got some really strange ideas about the human soul and different things like that. He doesn't really believe in even in a lot of traditional Christian ideas. He's rejected, and he's got his own thing going. But when it comes to theistic evolution, I just asked him, like, why are we stuck at this level of evolution as humans? Why are we not evolving? Because he told me, when I asked him, he told me we're not going to evolve into something different. We are at the apex. We've arrived. Like, this is where it's at, and we're not going to go any further. The evolution is over and done with. We're at optimal configuration, optimal brain size, all this sort of stuff. It's like, well, according to, like, what's your authority? On what authority are you saying this? Oh, well, the scientists have measured, they know the perfect size of the brain, and we have the perfect size brain, and if it were larger, it wouldn't be good. If it were smaller, it wouldn't be good. And they've got, he's putting his faith in these so-called expert scientists that we are optimal, right? Instead of just thanking the creator for creating good bodies, good design, they're just saying, oh, well, we stumbled into this perfect highest form, and so there's nowhere else to go. We've reached the apex. So what's your gut reaction to that sort of argument?
I mean, I guess if you're going to merge the theory of evolution with theology, I think it's what I explained earlier. The theory of evolution is that man is aiming towards the best version of himself. Now, that itself is rather interesting. Why does that need to be how evolution functions? Like, it's almost like there's something metaphysical to that. If there's an aiming towards a greater good, like, for me, like, I can't necessarily accept the theory of evolution without putting God somewhere in that. And if I deny the theory of evolution, well, of course, I automatically have to accept God either way. But again, the concept in Christianity that I find, and this person was coming from a Christian view, I suppose, is that you have Adam and Eve in the perfect four, and then there's a fall, a decline in mankind, in our state. We're in the fallen state. That's why Christ comes to us, because it's like the Garden of Eden where Adam and Eve are walking with God. And so he's bringing that back. And it's in Christ that you have the apex or the fullness of that. And I mean, I feel like evolution is a literal inversion of that. At this point, I mean, at least what I'm saying, that's why I'm agnostic about the issue, but it seems like a literal inversion where it's not that we were in the fallen state in our very beginning, and from that are aiming towards the paradise, right? We're becoming the Ubermensch, and
Yeah,
that seems to be
exactly.
the conflict. And of course, you know, if there's a conflict between these two views, you could say, well, okay, then they're not compatible. Either you're an atheist or non-Christian evolutionist or a Christian creationist. And well, sure, I suppose, you know, you could come to a point where you can see that they're just not compatible. But then again, when it comes to that, like, again, I'm just finding there seems to be conflicts. Again, when you have a theory, it has to be consistent. You know, your theory has to be consistent. And if you're finding inconsistencies, that shows there's something wrong about your theory. And again, I was bringing those points up with the Big Bang Theory. There's things predating the Big Bang, like that you can't really have that. If something predates the Big Bang, the age of the universe, that shows there's something wrong with your theory straight up. If your mapping of the universe shows it's a certain day and things are conflicting that, it shows that maybe your theory was wrong to begin with, and you have to look at it in a different angle, and maybe that angle would show something different, right? But it's sort of like, you know, you have, like, again, the things where it's like you find these mass graves of dinosaurs, and that is like something sudden happened that basically all of them suddenly died and they got buried by all this substance and dirt and everything, kind of like a chaotic flood, ironically. And you have little things like, okay, well, you have people like these fossilized human footprints or what have you, and then these dinosaur footprints together, another conflict. I was trying to see, okay, how can you disprove that? Well, you had one person who was saying, oh, well, it's not just hoax, it's just a lie, it's not true. Well, you can't just claim it's not true when I'm just showing you what it is. And someone was in a state of denial on the internet about it when I was trying to see, okay, what arguments do people have against this? And it was just this state of denialism, like, oh, well, no, it's just wrong. Can you give me the case? Like, you have these fossilized human footprints and dinosaur footprints. There doesn't seem to be much other than that. Okay, well, your theory of evolution, there's conflict, and that shows that your theory was wrong to begin with. A theory that's true needs to be consistent. And all these things do seem to be a bit consistent, you know, with the idea of maybe the flood and whatnot. And you could say, okay, well, why is it that you have certain layers that dinosaurs are buried under? Okay, well, I don't know necessarily. I don't know. But then again, I don't even know if that's necessarily true, that because you go to a certain layer that you're going to find those specific dinosaurs. I think that's just a location you go to. Like, are those dinosaurs like always at the same measurement below the Earth all around the globe? I'm sure there's some other location in the world where they're a different layer deep or higher above. Like, it seems to be like, you know, it's I mean, when you have conflicts like that, it just kind of tears it apart. It tears it apart. So that's where I'm kind of like, okay, well, I don't know if I would not say anymore that I believe in evolution, right? But that's where I'm sticking, where I'm agnostic on the issue right now. But it's definitely a thing where it's like, okay, well, there's clear conflicts with it. There's clear conflicts.
Yeah. Well, I sent you in the little chat of this Google Meet, I sent you a link to Michael Jones' interview. He's the Protestant Christian guy. And if you take the time and listen to that and then give me feedback next time we speak.
Sure.
It's a very interesting interview, and I try to press him on a couple of issues. But he believes that Adam and Eve were not a single human pair, that they're not literally our first parents, and that they were basically no brighter than apes. Like they're sort of just slightly more evolved than an ape. So I mean, I find that insulting to our first parents, who were far superior to us in every way.
Yeah, I mean, Adam and Eve were kind of in that perfect state, and what Christ came to do is to restore that paradise that was lost.
Yeah.
So, if Adam and Eve were like just apes, if it was just an image for prior to a certain state of our evolution, and it's like, okay, well, did Christ come to make us apes again? Like, is that what heaven's about? Is that we'll just be apes in the jungle of heaven? Like, it seems like Christ came to restore something much greater than our current state, and it was that which was lost in paradise when Adam and God were walking together.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like I had that symbolic perspective on it for a while, but it seems like there's some issues with that. Like, it's just like you're manipulating the Bible to such a degree. It's like, okay, well, let's say I were to believe that Adam and Eve are true. For instance, the Catholic Church, you do have to believe that Adam and Eve existed, or at least believe that we had first parents, right? Okay, well, let's say you read the Bible, you have Adam and Eve. Those were real figures. Okay, well, I mean, I don't know how I can acknowledge that those people existed without having to then acknowledge that God made Adam out of dirt and that Eve came from Adam's rib. Like, that's a part of the narrative of Adam and Eve.
Yeah.
You have a story. These two people named Adam and Eve. This is how they came together. This is how they were made. Okay, well, you don't believe that, but you believe that these people exist. But it all seems to be a fitting narrative that is kind of like you're just twisting, cherry picking. It's rather difficult for me to kind of take that position at this point. But yeah, I mean, I mean, I don't want to stick with evolution forever.
No.
I just wanted to bring that up because I was generally just kind of where I'm at, what I'm thinking of.
Watch the video though. Watch the video that I sent you, or listen to it because it's audio only. And I want to get your feedback next time. But we'll move on now to your other bullet points on your notes there.
Mm-hmm. Oh, no, that was basically, I just wanted to bring up evolution because I was interested. I was kind of curious. But other than that, I mean, like, yeah, I suppose that's it for the evolution take. Again, there's probably someone who can destroy me on issue on either side. They'll be like, here's why you're going on the right or wrong path on this, and show me all these things I just don't know. But again, I'm just agnostic on the issue, and I think that like you can read the Bible and you can who was it? I don't want people to think that because I believed in evolution and kind of in this agnostic position that I don't believe the Bible, because I do. And I think inspiring philosophy, who I'm not really so much into, but he does show that. I think he does show that you can still believe the Bible and have like a valid interpretation.
That's what I sent you. That's the interview I sent you, Michael Jones. Okay.
I can check it out. I think I've seen something of his where he kind of has this position, right? Where he kind of, he does explain it well, where how you can be a Bible-believing Christian and somehow still have an interpretation where evolution is true. But again, I'm at an agnostic position where it's like, okay, well, I'm at a point where it's like, I'm finding conflicts with it, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's safe that like the Catholic Church says that you can accept the theory of evolution, but you have to at least say Adam and Eve are real people or whatever. But then again, it's like, I feel like that's sort of like the whole debate of whether you receive communion on the hand or tongue. It's like, which is more to the traditional view, right? Than what the church is simply allowing you to do.
Yeah.
And so I think like the traditional view is kind of clear on that, and that it's just giving the option that, well, you could accept evolution if you want, but
we're not going to kick you out of the church.
Yeah, but there does seem to be a more traditional position on it that, like it's just there. But yeah, I mean,
absolutely.
Like I said, I don't want to stick on evolution. It's just that I was curious and just kind of what I'm going through right now in my head, my thought process of questioning all this stuff, right?
No problem. Well, you're going to watch that Michael Jones, or listen to it, and then we'll talk about it more next time. But for today, we'll move on. We've done pretty much 40 minutes, so we got about 20 minutes, 25 minutes left before I got to go hang out with my wife. So let's talk. Let's dig into some more stuff, like if it's topics from the Bible or philosophy. What are you excited about?
Well, I've explained this before, maybe not here, but on some other places. So one thing I've noticed, and this was from a course I took, I don't know if I mentioned this to you on the podcast at all, but this is sort of maybe philosophical, but it's just kind of how civilization is built. And if you go to like some ancient part of Asia, or there's places like this in Europe too, you would have like a church or a temple on like a high hill of some kind,
Yeah.
overtowering a city.
Yeah. Most important
And
place. Most
that
prominent
was sort
place.
of kind of like a hierarchy of
Yeah.
how civilization was built, right?
Yeah.
And you kind of had this greater absolute of what the people of that city had over them. And now in our modern structure, you have skyscrapers overshadowing churches. And so it's like kind of an inversion of that, where the church is put in the corner, and now you have businesses and whatnot that are at the top overshadowing it. You have this famous church, I think, in New York City, that's like between all these skyscrapers that are like overtowering and overshadowing it. And it's like, well, is that right? Is that morally right? I mean, what does that do to our psyche? And it's sort of like this different thing. But I'm thinking like there's all this chaos going on. Like for instance, in Toronto, right? All this like fighting and people doing drugs and chasing each other and threatening each other. And the same thing I think is happening in New York. New York and Toronto, all these people that are just chaotic and trying to get you because I don't know. I'm not going to sit there and ask them why they're chasing me. But you have those people that, and they do that. And I think that, like for instance, right? What do you do with shit, right? What do you do with shit? And I was thinking, well, okay, you take it in your hand, right? The slobbery, juicy shit, right? And you dump it down the toilet and you flush it down, right? I don't know. Some people were saying you don't hold it, but I could
To
ask
each
them
his
more
own.
about
To each
that.
his own.
But so when you have a city that is just shit at this point, I think it's just time for it to go. Just it can go. Flush it down the toilet, right? Um, I mean, the Catholic Church is there. You can keep that. You can build like a Catholic theocracy on top of the remaining remnants of the city, I guess. But I guess like it's just such an inversion that I don't think any of this will be fixed. And Toronto and all these places are just our Western mindset. We can keep the whole false gospel of tolerance and be like, oh, we just need to love each other for who we are and whatnot, no matter what. Well, sure, you have to love everybody, but you can't just accept them no matter what. I mean, if someone is going to hurt you, I don't think I want to be near them. I'm going to push back. I mean, I can say I love them, but I'm not. I don't know if acceptance and tolerance always is synonymous with love. But I think as long as we keep this false gospel of tolerance, that this is always going to persist, it's just going to become more chaotic, and you're going to have more just like chaos until we have intolerance, where we kind of have a fear of hell in people and instruct in society, that it will kind of diverse from where it is today. And I think that that's kind of the point where we're at now, is that like really like all this can go away and just build a I don't know, a Catholic theocracy on top of that. And I don't want to scare any people, but I know history. I know history, and I know how history works. And whenever sort of, and again, I'm not really going to affirm myself here on whether I'm like far left or far right or any political position, right? But it seems like history always has the same thing that occurs. And I'm not saying I'm in favor of this at all, but typically when you have a far left political ideology that sort of maps out the society of the people, like you had, for instance, Canada and is like this. America is like this a lot too, a little lesser, but very much radically so. And just kind of the West in general, this general state of the West is very politically left leaning. We're pro-abortion, pro-LGBT, pro everything. And I'm not trying to affirm my position on these issues. I'm just stating just how history works. But generally, it's all far left leaning politics. Pro-immigration, open borders. Even though no one actually supports open borders, we just spew that out as a talking point. But then the Democrats don't necessarily want the borders to be open 100%. Because they're not idiots as much as they might sound to be. But there's all these just little things, right? And I guess you could, as an analogy, it's the yin and the yang. But there always seems to be a far right reactionary movement that always stems out of this. And any instance in history, I could say like take any right-wing figure in history who was devastating. They never came from accident. They always came from this like over communized leftist society that sprung out this reactionary movement. And because this is on a more global scale, that's the only issue where it's a bit more scary, because you can't just say, okay, well, it's this little place tucked in the corner, someplace in the world that this occurred, but now it's kind of like the whole state of the West. And it kind of seems like the whole West might birth out a reactionary right-wing movement. And I'm not saying I'm in favor of that, because I don't want people to die. So I don't want anyone to die. I'm pro-life. I don't want anyone being killed. I don't like that. No. But I'm just saying that's kind of just how history seems to work. Maybe it's like Carl Jung kind of thing, like just the ions or whatever, how the things that are behind our society and our consciousness and psyche, how it kind of functions in us, and kind of just the science is how society lays itself out, right? But the issue with tolerance is that there's no it's all abstracts, right? To each their own kind of deal. And the thing with that is that there's no backbone to society. Society needs a backbone, a structure to uphold it. And when you don't have that backbone, it just kind of collapses. And that's what you do when it's like, oh, well, everything's just abstract. There's no real objective truth. Well, if there's no objective truth for the people, if we just love and accept everything and everyone, well, it kind of just collapses on itself, because there's nothing to hold it up. That's singular. And something has to uphold the system, just how society lays itself out, just how things roll out. And whether that's a truth or a lie, something has to take that place, and something will. And I think that's why you see people so immediately not rationalizing it too much. They're so prone to accept things like Marxism, communism, and then on the other side, nationalism and fascism and all of that stuff. And I think it's like it's subconscious. People are always just going to accept these things because something has to be the backbone. And because we kind of lost that Christendom, so to speak, we're at a point where it's like, well, now it's every other political extreme alternative. And it's like this kind of just outside of our control. Something has to take place of that, right? And something will. And I don't know really what it will be, because it seems like those in power kind of wanted to aim at one angle, kind of this Nietzschean view. It's rather weird, but listening to the people who are behind the global reset, because I'm learning in this, they're using religious terms and they're literally speaking in like Nietzschean terminology. Like they are basically worshiping Friedrich Nietzsche, and I'm aware of his work and his philosophy, and I'm sure he's I've delved a lot into him, and it's like they're speaking with his phrasing, like they've read his books and are trying to carry on his view of the world, basically this like concept of the Übermensch and all this interesting, odd, disturbing things. I mean, like they're just like it's odd, but it's like they're clearly learned in his work. And you have certain people in history who also were trying to carry out Friedrich Nietzsche's will to power. Like literally, right? I mean, for instance, you had the people, Germany literally made a documentary back in the day celebrating that philosophy, right? You have the propaganda film, I think it's Triumph the Will. And they're all sort of fulfilling this Nietzschean view of how things have to be. And, it is Antichrist. And that's not me speaking as a Christian. Like Nietzsche, that's how he himself affirms it. It's a literal inversion of Christian morality. Because Christianity had such an uphold, we need to have such an inversion, right? And it's also kind of Freemasonic. I love anyone who's Freemason. I don't know anyone, but then again, I don't know how I would know. I've never been in Freemasonry. And one thing is that, like, to just prove that is that I'm pretty sure if you're a Freemason, you cannot say that you're not. So I'm saying I'm not, and that itself affirms that I'm not. But
I'm
this
not
sort of
either.
view that you'll good to clarify. I mean, something that I've noticed is that some of the people at the top, the 33 degree or whatever it's called, the way that, and because a lot of their writings are public, like people will make all these conspiracy theories on Freemasons when there's like I call it a public library. Like there's writings that you can just read from these people, like the quote unquote popes of Freemasonry. You can read from them. Like it's not like, everything just, you don't know, like, and it's crazier than any conspiracy theory made about them, like what you can actually read it from them. And one thing is this view of like, okay, well, we have to kind of get rid of Christendom, which is kind of, it was first, the first stage of accomplishing that was like the French Revolution, and sort of like this making society more atheist, ridding religion entirely to a state of nihilism and atheism, to a point of despair where the people will be in such a despair state that they'll realize how they actually need religion, how necessary it is for people to function as individuals and as a collective in society. And that's where they'll then put in place a sort of satanic Luciferian sort of part of that. And that's what we're finding is being put in place. Instead of, if you went to school like several decades ago, or maybe like more than just that, you would have a cross in the classroom, right? And that was the identity. The greater good that's above us was our identity as a collective. Well, now it's all this narcissistic, self-centered on oneself. You have flags in the classroom that literally fixate on, okay, well, what's your, sexual orientation or gender or race or any, they'll do this for religion too. Like, what's your religious identity, right? It's like all this like aiming at oneself, right? And it's the inversion, like it's this inversion of aiming at oneself, this weird idolatry of self almost, but it's the we mentioned, it's and again, it's what they're trying to do, and that's sort of the accomplishment of the Antichrist. It's a literal inversion, and I'm pretty sure this is what the Catechism of the Catholic Church states, is that what is the Antichrist? It's a solution that will be presented to mankind. It's false, but it's this alternative solution, and that sort of seems to be what it is. Of course, people will be like, oh, okay, well, isn't the Antichrist a person? Well, sure. I mean, maybe some point in history there'll be a person who properly represents all of this, what's going on. If you have someone who like shows up as like the head of all of this, and publicly so, I mean, I guess there you have it, or his successor or whatever have you. But so far, the Antichrist is an ideology. That's what's kind of going on. And of course, you have the biblical view that like the Antichrist, there's been many Antichrists, and that is sort of this like, it's a system as well as an individual. And that's what I've always affirmed, is that it's both a person and an ideology. And it's rather interesting. But the scary thing is if Christianity is not true and all that, right? Like, let's say you're an atheist and you don't believe all this. You have people who want the Antichrist to be true. And that is so odd. But, it's what they basically want to do. And again, it's that inversion of the way civilization is put together. You would have a church or a temple, whether you were in Europe and you have a church, or even ancient parts of Asia where it's like a temple of some kind, like a Buddhist temple on a high mountain of sorts, overtowering the city of peasants below. It's what worked. It's what worked because you had this sort of supernatural hierarchy at the top. But now it's like the naturalism, the materialist skyscrapers of businesses that overshadow the little church at the bottom, that's a body for a supernatural temple in society that contains the supernatural. And it's this inversion. It all seems to be deliberate from the French Revolution, and it's kind of all mapping itself out. But I mean, that's how prophecy works. The only thing is that if all this is working out, the only thing is that the Bible basically says that they're all going to go to hell at the end. And so the thing is, if all of this is true, with their wanting to summon the Antichrist spirit in society, in the world, if it's true, I mean, like, how true is it that you're going to actually summon the second coming? And it's like, I wonder, if you're in that position where you really do believe in the philosophy of the Antichrist, where Nietzsche literally writes a book defending it as Antichrist. He just straight up says like that, like he this is what they admit they want. Okay, well, I mean, I don't know how you can get away with the fact that, okay, well, if you're saying that the Bible prophecy is true and this is what you're aiming at, I mean, what about the fact that Christ is going to come again and jihad all of you up? Like, that seems like, Christ is coming back for jihad, and it's like, maybe I shouldn't use that term to describe it, but coming back to crusade, or I don't know, it sounds more fun if you're saying that Jesus is coming back for jihad. But like, if that's what's going on, Like, I mean, I don't know. It's complicated for me. It's like you're in that one position, but then it's like all of that is ultimately it's the yin yang, right? You had Christendom in as a power, and now you're having the inversion of that, sort of this Antichrist philosophy that's going on today. Well, okay, well then what's if you make it so real, if you make it so real, this utter inversion of Christianity, then what about the rebirth of Christianity that's going to be stronger than ever, where maybe you'll literally have the person of Christ himself coming in the clouds? It seems like this back and forth thing. It's like, are you aware that you may very well trigger this real thing? Like if you're very much affirming the Antichrist as real, like, well then how far do you have to go to affirm the second coming as a real thing? And that's, I don't know how to explain it so great, but I'm at that position where it's like, but then again, I'm not on that side of the Antichrist, but I'm trying to rationalize, like, how could you take that position?
Well, think about Pharaoh and the 10 plagues of Moses. Okay, think about that. And it says that God hardened the heart of Pharaoh. And St. Augustine says that what that means is that God allowed Pharaoh to harden his own heart, because God, there is a certain form of predestination for heaven and for hell. It's a partial predestination in the Catholic worldview. Okay, it's not the Calvinist extreme of absolute predestination, but there is a Catholic version of predestination. So, God will allow some vessels to be for dishonor and other vessels for honor, but he does not do any evil ever. God does not do any evil ever. So when God, hardened Pharaoh's heart, we have to understand that was Pharaoh's fault. It wasn't God's fault. But when we think about that story, I think Pharaoh repented a few times during that story, at least near the end with the 9th and 10th plagues. He was softening, and he repented, and he let them go and this sort of thing, and then of course chased after them, and he always changed his mind. But it's a sad example of how people can cheer on the Antichrist. They can be on board with the Antichrist because the heart wants what the heart wants. And at this point, it becomes a toxic addiction. I want myself to be first. I want to love myself unto contempt of God, because that's what I'm in the habit of doing. I'm addicted to myself as this idol. And it's a form of idolatry, but it's also a form of adultery, as it says in the book of Hosea, among other prophets. It talks about the identity of idolatry and adultery. It's the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned, like, I see a lot of conspiracy theories about like Freemasons, all this stuff, and it's like I can get exhausted from some of it. Like it's just like give me a break. But as someone who's learned in like some of the Freemasonic literature, it's so much worse than what the conspiracy theories admit. Like
I
it's
read
like
the
so
Alta Vendita. I read
Huh?
that one. The Alta Vendita. Are you aware of that document?
I don't think I've looked
It's a
at that.
It's a short little sort of outline of their goals and objectives of destroying Christianity and so on and so forth.
And it's like I'm not trying to be a religious zealot and calling them Antichrist. Like I'm saying that they themselves affirm that they believe in the Antichrist and that part of the Bible narrative. But it's like, again, like it gets me confused because it'd be like I'm not going to give an example, but like it's just it's laid there in the Bible because it's going to be what takes over and then fails. It just, I don't get like how you can look and be like, okay, this is what I'm gonna hold to, even though if you're holding that as true, how much, like, you can't really, it's, I mean, I don't get it, but again, I mean, I think honestly, now that I just thought of something, think of exorcisms. An exorcist can ask a demon, why did you reject Christ and everything, right? And for instance, right, a lot of what the exorcists kind of give as an insight from these demons is that the demons kind of rejected Christ for pride, right? Because, for instance, one thing is maybe Lucifer saw that Christ was going to become man, and not only that, but that a female human, was going to have one of the most highest positions in heaven, pretty much higher than himself, and it's like he couldn't tolerate that. If he could just had said yes at that moment, he would have been so happy and everything would have been so great. So why did he just say no? It suffers so much worse. Like there's no logic to it when you really consider it. And when you ask them about it, like, why did you really choose this knowing what would happen? They kind of just fall into this despair where they're whining and they don't answer you. And so I think that's as far as I can think when it comes to me trying to rationalize how can you be on the side of Antichrist, and not me like calling it Antichrist. Like that's what they actually believe. They say, yes, it's this is what we choose this part. And it's like, well, how can you? I can't rationalize it when it's like this phase. Because for instance, the church is the body of Christ, right? So the body of Christ on earth, or the physical body of Christ on earth was crucified and rose again. And so the mystical body that is the church has to be crucified under the Antichrist, then resurrect again at the second coming. So it's like, okay, well, like if you could somehow have known everything was going to happen, right? That Pontius Pilate and all those people were going to kill Christ, like all that was going to happen, but you had a full picture, like of that narrative of the resurrection too. It's like, how could you then side on Pilate and the other side? like how could you side with them? Like it doesn't seem to make any sense, right? But and then it's like the larger picture, right? Like the Antichrist, and then that it's like I'm struggling, but I think that's a good thing. I think that there's not really any rationality, and that may be a sign of clear diabolical possession. The fact that that example from exorcism, then you kind of have this thing going on with well, the elites or whatever, and it's like, again, I'm not making any conspiracy theories on it. Make that very clear. Like this is what they literally affirm the Antichrist as their ideology, and I'm just saying, like, I'm not trying to be that religious zealot on the corner of the street being like, you're Antichrist and you're Antichrist and you're going to hell and whatnot. Like their mouths affirm that they profess the Antichrist, and they and there's certain positions where they literally take a blood oath to Satan, but that's a whole other thing. Not a conspiracy theory. I'm saying like, but the popes of Freemasonry, and I know they're not literal popes, but to give like an analogy that people can understand, the popes of Freemasonry basically explain that. Like if the Pope came out and said, okay, well, we love Jesus and that's what our faith is, I don't think that's a conspiracy theory to say that Catholics are believe in Christ. Like it doesn't really make sense. But when you have the quote unquote the equivalent of popes and Freemasonry, it's more like orthodoxy. It's more like a collective of people. I mean, maybe they have a hidden top figure, but I don't know. Maybe that's the Antichrist. I don't know. But when they come out and they're explaining how their ideology is, you have to take this blood oath to Lucifer. It's just so bizarre. And one thing, I mean, I think this was some guy was saying, I heard him explaining this, is like, when it comes to Freemasonry, right? They have some of the best arguments for God's existence. Like they know that God is real. You have to believe in God to become a Freemason in the first place, I believe. And they kind of explain where Christianity is the true religion, and they give like the best argument that's just objective. Like, okay, that's the fact. And then their ultimate conclusion is to take a blood oath to Lucifer. It's like, oh, okay, well, you almost had it. You almost had it. I mean, there's not really much rationality going on, but I mean, I guess just hold to the Bible. That's what you've got to do today.
Yeah, well, there's this hand in hand with pride goes spitefulness, where you just want to spite. It's like being a jilted lover kind of thing, where you get caught cheating on your spouse and then you hate your spouse, but you're the one who cheated. But you hate your spouse because they're pure, they're innocent, they didn't do anything wrong, but you hate them because
Mm-hmm.
you don't like facing your own weakness, facing your own pride, facing your own sin. So you hate your spouse and you demonize your spouse, even though they're innocent and you're guilty. But this is psychologically, this is very, very, very common, very common. And it's not only among couples, parents with children, children with parents, friends with friends, whatever. It's very, very, very common. And this idea of projection also, to project your nonsense onto someone who's healthy, and no one's perfectly healthy, obviously, but there's so many layers of the psychology. But the bottom line is, you have to be like little children. We have to be like little children, pure, innocent, wholesome, simple, straightforward, not convoluted with all kinds of neuroses, psychoses, lies, deception, self-deception, and drunk and on drugs, and in the brothel, and full of violence and all the iniquity and all the things that St. Paul lists, of people who are lost ultimately, unless by some miracle they repent and they swallow their pride. But that's what we're up against, and that's what this world is full of. It's full of pride,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a very challenging. It's a very, very challenging place to be. It's challenging for those who are going to hell, and it's challenging for those of us who choose not to go to hell and who are striving to love God and to
Mm-hmm.
know God and to serve God in this life, you know?
Yeah, like I don't want to dox anyone, but I know this bookstore. There's this bookstore that I know. I don't really go to it because there's better bookstores with more books that I like. But there's one bookstore, and they have all this like old Freemasonic literature that probably only exists in that bookstore. That's rather interesting. And you have whatever his name is, Palmer or whatever, and they have a monument around for him around that general location. And it's like he founded I think it was chiropractic. Like all these people who founded all these like alternatives to science and whatnot were literally summoning demons. And that's not me as a Christian like pointed at them as like a religious, they're like, you're a demon worshiper. Like they like Carl Jung, as much as I love him because I was getting into psychology and everything. In his, I don't know, it's either the red book or the black book. He basically explains how he sold his soul to this demon thing. That's how he consulted and got all this information. It's like all these people, for your, if you're an atheist out there, it's like all these people who founded all your scientific methods did so by consulting this occult knowledge, this secret knowledge, gaining knowledge from these demonic forces or what have you. And that's rather bizarre. But I think exorcism is probably one of the top things for me that proves the faith is true. Is like, okay, if you take a Catholic priest and he prays over someone and their faith, the face starts to morph, or they start to levitate. I don't think that's because they have anxiety. If you have a Catholic priest who starts praying over them and they start like speaking in this dead language, and like the experts come in and they were like, oh my goodness, we didn't even know how this language worked, but this person is speaking it. Now we know how this language properly functions. I don't think that's a bipolar episode. If a priest is praying over someone and their face, that dislocates and whatnot, their jaw and all that, I don't think, they need therapy, maybe to help them along with that. But I think like that's one of the greatest proofs is that there is a real demonic force out there or spiritual warfare, and that, it's like, okay, what's the solution? Well, it's the faith, right? It's Christ, it's the Bible, it's, the rosary, all that stuff. I mean, if you're Catholic, like go to church on Sunday, at least, try to go to confession as often as you can, before receiving communion, of course, and as just like your daily practice, maybe try to read the Bible, maybe try to pray the rosary. And, it's honestly the best thing that can be done. It's rather simple. And that's the thing. The Christian life is simple. And, I mean, I know like it can get stressing because of how much just nonsense is out there. Last time I mentioned this, but the chaplet of the Holy Face, I never really chose that devotion. It's just that people in my life have kind of thrown it at me where it's like, okay, well, maybe something's going on, right? And there's it. I forget the term, but it's sort of this Davidic prayer, right? Like how David prayed in the Psalms. It's basically to quote one of the prayers in the chaplet: "Arise, O Lord, and let thy enemies be scattered, and let them that hate thee flee from before thy face." And there's something relieving, as much as we can pray, for the conversion of those people as well, right? But there's something of a relief to kind of just let go
Yeah.
of the weight, right? And be like, you take care of it and
Yeah.
all that stuff, right? But there's something that brings relief. And it's not necessarily at people, it can be more at the real enemies, which are the demons, right? Because, a part of spiritual awakening, if you want to call it that, of being a Christian, is to realize that we don't battle against flesh and blood. It's these spiritual powers, right? And that's the ultimate enemy. So and the thing too, right? The people who are in certain positions of Freemasons, and again, I don't want to attack people who are Freemason. There's good people, I understand that, especially if you're like on a first rank or whatever, and you're not necessarily in the top ranking to know everything about it. But a lot of these people are like consulting diabolical energies, have you? And if we called on like Saint Michael and all the angels to cut that off, what would happen? Like, I'm just thinking, right? And plus, those who were in the elite power at certain times did convert. Like you had St. Paul, who was persecuting Christians, working for the bad guys, quote unquote. You had who was it? Maybe it was Constantine, if I'm remembering correctly, who was like the head of the Roman Empire. I could be wrong, but pretty sure he was. And if I'm remembering correctly, he did convert to Christianity and Christianized Rome. So it's like, well, what if, the quote unquote Illuminati, those in Masonic and power, and those in the charge of a small country across the ocean in this little small part of the world, like what if those people in power who ruled converted in a sense or had some sort of revelation happen? I mean, those who were instigating society to become less and less Christian, a literal inversion of Christianity in society, this sort of manifesting of the Antichrist spirit, like what if those people converted? It's like that would be rather interesting, right? I mean, like for instance, the media attacks the faith a lot, but what if those people in the media converted? Like it's a rather interesting thing to consider, and those who are kind of pushing us in a certain narrative. And so I think it's a thought I've had, but right, but like calling on Saint Michael, calling on the angel of God, on Mary, and just calling on God, of course, and just like cut it off and maybe spark their conversion. Like that's a rather interesting thought. But of course, those who are being taken advantage of by all of this, those who are being led astray, right? Those who are falling for kind of this deception, have you? Of course, I suppose they're sort of more pertinent because, which is worse, you going to hell unaware or just deliberately choosing? I'm not really a theological expert, but I think that if you go to hell without knowing it's kind of more bad, right? And if you rather than deliberately choosing, where it's like, okay, well then that's just totally on you, right? We can pray for those people, but maybe more so for the people who are just ignorant and kind of being influenced by all this, right? Um, People who are kind of people who are falling away from the church and whatnot, those people who are kind of falling to the mainstream society, so to speak, right? And those people, I suppose. But I mean, of course, you pray for everyone, but I suppose maybe those are more pertinent. I don't know.
I like to think about when I pray for everyone, I like to think about the different spectra. So you can have a spectrum on this axis, a spectrum on that axis, and you can explore that and just think about that. One of these spectra that I explore, that I pray about, is those who are easiest to help by my prayers, all the way down to those who are hardest or most difficult to help by my prayers, and everyone in between. And it's fascinating thinking about that. Who is easiest to help by my prayers? Well, probably someone who's amenable to prayer, someone who asked me to pray for them. Hey, David, will you pray for me? My faith is struggling, or I'm having troubles, or I'm under demonic attack. Will you pray for me? Yes, that person is probably easy to help by my prayers, relative to someone who says, your religion is a joke, your God is a joke, everything's a joke, and we're apes and we evolved over millions of years. There's no meaning, nothing happens. When you die, you're just food for the flowers, and so on and so forth. Okay, that person's probably harder to help than the one who's like, please pray for me and mine, right? So I like to think about that spectrum, and we can shift, we can move around a little bit from day to day, from moment to moment on that spectrum. Like I might be easier to pray for, to be helped now by your prayers, than at another time when I'm frustrated, I'm in rebellion, I'm in full of pride, I'm full of hatred. Those moments arise in a day, So we're not fixed on one particular spot on any of these spectra, but it's something interesting to contemplate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, for sure. I mean, I suppose, Christ in the gospel explains like love not only your neighbor but your enemy also. But I think like he wasn't necessarily saying put your enemy first. It's just like love them along, right? Like of course, maybe you can love your neighbor, but then love your enemy also, right? Instead of just putting your neighbor and neglecting the enemy, love the neighbor, right? That's the second commandment, right? But then love your enemy. I don't think he necessarily was saying love your enemy more than your neighbor, if that makes sense, right? And some people maybe have that attitude, but I think that it's important. Like, okay, well, when it comes to praying for others, like maybe there's a hierarchy. Like I think it's important, like if for instance doing so for your parents, your family, your children, right?
Yeah.
Then maybe just people in your life, and then there's a hierarchy to how it goes, and then of course the people who maybe aren't so generous on that end. But I think that there is definitely a hierarchy to things, and that's one of the things that society neglects, which is sort of where we're messed up, right? Because one thing, for instance, right, that you're not really allowed to say because you're deemed as misogynist and sexist is just to state this fact that the father is the head of the household. Okay, well, I'm not saying that as a religious person or anything like that, but take the father away and it does collapse. Like it's not a religious belief. The church is just stating the obvious. The way that the family functions is as though the father were the head of the household. That doesn't mean superior. That's not is not a sense of supremacy. That's not what I'm saying. But just in the rule of how it functions, and that's what psychology shows. It's what the science shows. As much as the quote unquote scientists don't really care about the actual science, is that a father who prays every day, goes to mass and whatnot, and gives that example to his children, they're practically guaranteed to be faithful Catholics, right? And again, I don't want to put any single parents out there in despair, right? But there's a lot more like when you're a mother, a single mother raising kids, doing all that, that it's like 50-50. They can totally have the chance of leaving the faith. And it's like, why is that? And it's rather interesting, but single and again, I come from a single mom, so I don't have any issue with that. And I think Augustine even was converted in the most radical sense because of his own mother. So I'm not trying to say no injustice to the as if there's nothing to it. I'm just pointing it out is that like you have little things like that, and that there is a real hierarchy to things. And I think that's something too about what people don't understand about how civilization is supposed to function is that it's sort of like the community and the family. Then you have the state, but you need something that's supernatural, something that's metaphysical, where the church is kind of in that position of power. And that's something that people don't really understand in the debate of separation of church and state. It's like, well, okay, you need something. There's a metaphysical hierarchy to the way how things function. You have the family, the community, the society, you have the government, and you have something that's metaphysical, and that's the spiritual body that's in position. That would be sort of like the Pope, for instance, and maybe it's feudalism, if I'm remembering the term, kind of like the medieval hierarchy of how civilization worked. You had the peasants, then the knights and the lords, and then you had the king and then the Pope. And people sort of look down at that. But the real benefit to that form of feudalism is that everyone knew their proper role in society. No one was questioning their gender or sexuality because they knew their proper role in society and what it was for, whether that was a peasant in the garden with your kids or a king or lord or what have you, or just the Pope himself. Like everyone had a proper role and function in this pyramid of structure of society, right? And everyone kind of knew. Whereas you want to equalize everything, it's a false gospel of tolerance, right? It's a false promise. And so I suppose that's interesting. And what have you. I'm just looking at something. I don't know what that is. Anyway, okay. Yeah, well,
A creature.
that's something food for thought. Yeah.
All right. Well, that's a good place to wrap it up because I got to go hang with the wife. But you have a lot to say. I appreciate everything that you said today, that you shared with me and with my audience. And we're gonna dig deeper into all kinds of stuff next time. And just whatever's on your mind, because you're a bright young man in love with Christ and his church, and you're gonna always have something on your heart to share with me and my listeners. So I really appreciate that.
Sure.
I hope you'll come back soon. Okay.
Sure. I mean, one more thing. I mean, just a message of hope, right?
Yeah.
First the bad news or whatever, the bad outlook on things is that you have hang on, sorry about that. You have people like maybe Martin Luther in the 1500s, like one person, right, who kind of causes all this, right? One person who causes all this mass rebellion. And that's something interesting is that, like, you have in history one figure who kind of causes a shift of heresy, right? And that's why we even name certain heresies after an individual, because that's kind of where it stems from. And yet in the Bible, you also have the narrative of a prophet who comes and fixes it all. You have in church history a saint who corrects a heresy, right? Like Saint Dominic preaching a rosary, and that fixed it all. And so, all it takes is a person, right, to really shift all this. there's instances in history where it really is one person who, because of what they go through, it inspires them to kind of bring change, and that's what happened. So I'm just saying, like, for instance, how many people are at your church? Probably more than 12 people. And yet it was those 12 people, those 12 apostles in the upper room that basically changed the world, right? And yet you have one church that has more than 12 people. It only takes one church gathering to change the world. And that's a rather interesting thing to think. But the ripple effect that everything has on each other, ultimately it would be on God's hand. But the fact that the church is really being crucified at this time, I think it's just more evidence of a guaranteed resurrection, not necessarily literal, but like even figurative, like in society. Again, I don't know how he'll play about, but maybe because I mentioned earlier the way that society is structured, where the skyscrapers overshadow the church, maybe it does need to kind of flush away. And that's not, I'm not saying anyone to do anything. That's not, don't take it that way. But it could be like that old prophecy of fire raining down, and whatever that means, maybe something will happen, and we'll take advantage of the worst, is what I'm saying. We'll take advantage of the worst, and maybe from the dust of the earth, we'll rebuild a Catholic theocracy on top of all the scrubble that's been left behind. I don't know, but ultimately, from death, as Christians, we should understand the resurrection, not just in a literal sense, but even just figurative, and how things work out and whatnot. So that's what I'll leave there.
Excellent. As you were speaking, I was thinking about Christ when he said, leave those people alone, because if they're not against me, they're for me. But he also said, if you're not for me, you're against me. So it's a very cut and dry thing. This is the fundamental option that we have as humans in this fallen world. Which side are you on? Saint Ignatius of Loyola said there are two encampments on two hills under two banners, the banner of Christ and the banner of Satan, and you just have to choose the two camps. Which one are you in? That's it. That's the fundamental option. And so for me, the litmus test for any human where they stand is that, are you with us or are you against us? And, Christ said, I did not come to bring peace, but a sword that divides, and family member against family member, and on and on. It's a result of the fall, the original sin and everything else. But for you, when you go to bed at night, and hopefully you say your prayers at night, you reaffirm your position. I'm with you, God, and I already know it's the winning team. Like you were saying earlier, we know it's the winning team. So why would you go against it? Why would you go on the other team? Mm-hmm. So this is the message, and this is how I reassure myself that I don't need to have anxiety about the coming tribulations and all the difficulties that are coming, because I know that yes, I'm lazy, I'm selfish, and I'm stupid, whatever. But I know that I'm for Christ. I'm cheering for him, and I want him to rescue me. And it's not my strength that's going to do any of God's work or to be an instrument of God's grace. It's Christ who lives in me, to the extent that I am Christian, and may God help me to be fully Christian, to be fully alive. As the saints say, God's glory is man fully alive. So God help me to be a better man, to be more of a man, to be more Christian, because that's the side that I'm on paper, theoretically. So let's make it a reality, so that I can become either a martyr for Christ, a wet martyr, or a dry martyr, or some kind of martyr, and at least a witness with my tongue, at least, if not with my blood.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very good. That's very good.
So we'll leave it there. God bless you. Please remember me and mine in your prayers, because my family is all destroyed by Satan and his hatred for the family. And so I'd appreciate if you'd remember me in your prayers, okay?
Of course, of course.
And so we'll talk very soon. Book your next spot, because all the next 5 weeks are booked solid, so you're going to have to find a Friday to squeeze in, okay?
All right, thank you.
I love you, my brother. We'll talk soon.
All right, bye.
God bless you. Bye-bye.